I really think that music coming out of the continent in a lot of ways, it really does like describe like the tastemaker culture. As someone who's spent, time in Ghana as well as in the States, like I always hear the songs first in Ghana. I think because of the just diaspora nature, right? So people like myself or other first gen or second gen folks going home and saying like, oh wow, this is what's the next big thing out here.
All right, today we're joined by Denisha Kuhlor, who is the founder and CEO of Stan. And Denisha, you recently wrote a awesome guest piece in Trapital about the downside of music festivals. So why did you write this piece? Let's talk about it.
Yeah, so it's been something that's been in my mind for a long time. I think even on the consumer side, I've changed, I guess, how I patronize music and attend seeing artists, and really just wanted to talk about like how that impacts my relationship with the artist. I think we've been really conditioned and excited as consumers to attend festivals that optimize for seeing as many artists as possible. But when I think about some of my favorite music moments, frankly, they weren't at a festival. Always a show that the artists headlined themselves, and so when I think about the impact and with touring coming back, since restrictions because of COVID, I think it was really important to explore from both an artist and somewhat a fan perspective.
Yeah, one of the things I think you highlight as well, especially on the artist perspective too, we could easily get caught up in the allure of festivals. People always want to see who's headlining Coachella and what does it mean. And there's not going to be as much of a headlining or newsworthy thing if you're doing your own festival. But in a lot of ways, that's where you really meet your fans everywhere. And in a lot of ways, that makes much more of a difference in the long term, even if the initial check size isn't as big, which you called out.
Exactly. And in a weird way, festivals have almost become like very industry, I guess, and everything leading up to the festival, right? The politics behind being picked, where your name is on the flyer and what that represents. And while they're all great, I guess, points that can help an artist in the right direction, I think there's other ways to do it that maybe don't initially come with some of that fanfare. I totally agree.
So, what are some of those ways?
Yeah, so I really, to I guess put a tech or venture lens on it, but the great essay of like doing things that don't scale, right? Like I think so often as an artist or as an aspiring artist, it's really easy to look up to the really big things. Like you said, those are the things that are newsworthy. Those are the things that are covered and that people like see as amazing. But I think that artists right now have like a really unique ability to just play around, right? And play around with what that means. So I think a lot about Burna Boy's interview on Billboard recently. And even though he just like headlined MSG as the first Nigerian act to do that and has been breaking a ton of records, like he just kind of was like the next big thing for me is touring in like avant-garde venues or venues that you typically wouldn't. And while he's a big star, that's something that's really feasible for small artists as well, right? Venues in tradition, and that's why I love what like So Far Sounds is doing, or other platforms. But I think so often it's easy to have like a uniform idea of what a tour looks like, or even what connecting with your fans look like. And I think sometimes just bringing together like even 20 or 25 people that want to see you, that are willing to take their time in like this world of an attention deficit, like someone giving an hour, 2 hours of your time just to appreciate your art, is really amazing. And I think that artists are so used to like just sold out a thousand seats or 2,000 or 3,000, or the quantitative numbers kind of don't allow them to connect on a qualitative level.
Right. And everyone has to start somewhere. But I feel like in this era where there's so much instant gratification, people don't always want to go through the steps of shooting in the gym or any of that to get to that point. And I think part of what makes it tough, even if they are willing to do it, sometimes the optics can be a bit scary just because of how things are set up. I think one of the things that you mentioned in the piece, and we were talking about afterward, is just how if an artist gets booked on a festival, everyone may not necessarily be there to see them, even the people that are standing there. But there's this optic of, look at me performing in front of these 8,000 people that are immediately in front of me, right?
Yeah.
But if they go and do their own show and they can't sell 1,000 tickets, or if they have one of those things where they're performing and you can see so much space in between the people that are standing in the audience, then there's a bit of a vanity piece where it's like, are you comfortable with that, even though you know that that's how you build a fan
Yeah.
base?
Yeah, so true. As we were talking about that point, I thought a lot deeper about it, and a dynamic I think that's also really important is almost like how social media accessibility also plays from a peer perspective. And so these artists, while you can be a small or new or upcoming artist, you can, I guess, be or feel like your peers with artists that are way larger than you, just for proximity to that artist. And as a result, you almost kind of feel like embarrassed, if you will. It's like a freshman hanging out with a senior, right? They're going to do senior things, whether it's going to prom or whatever. But there's like really levels, and social media and I guess just other mediums have kind of taken away some of those levels. And as a result, to the like Issa Rae quote, people are so busy like networking up that they're not networking across. And as a result, who or what they compare themselves to creates a false sense of reality when it comes time for their own careers.
Yeah, great point. I think that if you're on that stage, you think, okay, yeah, I'm here, but you're really not. There's a huge difference. And as we both know, festivals get sold by the headliners, and
Yeah.
the smaller your font size is, for better or worse, the more interchangeable you actually are. And I think instance of this, I know I've written about this recently, was looking at Coi Leray, and a lot of people had made a bit of noise about where things look like from her perspective and her numbers, because she had so many things that were cosigns in her favor in terms of being
Yeah.
signed to Republic. She had songs with Nicki and Dirk. She performed on Fallon, BET Awards, Benzino's daughter, over 6 million
Yeah.
Instagram followers. But when it came time to sell her album, we're talking 11,500, or not 11,500, 11,500 units, which is around, I mean, less than 20 million streams in a week, which isn't
Yeah.
that much. There's plenty of other legacy albums that get more than that. And then they recently announced her tour, and she's doing a mix of festivals and tour stops. But her tour stops, they're cities in less than 500 capacity venues. And I don't
Yeah.
think it's just her necessarily. I think this applies to a lot of people, but it's just such a big difference where, okay, your followers are not necessarily your fans. And I think the distinction between touring and doing, festivals highlights that more than anything.
Yeah, I think she's been a really interesting one to watch, if only for all the things you mentioned. She's a great example of kind of new artists these days, and it begs the question, like, if attention at all even really equals any type of conversion to like true patronage. And something I find is that like in a digitally native generation, they don't view attention, or maybe even we don't necessarily view attention in a positive or negative sentiment. Just because in a way you're willing to give your attention to something doesn't mean in any way it's potentially in your favor when the time comes that attention will convert to something really tangible. But I also, in her case, being signed to Republic, I think it continues to like push that conversation of what A&R should look like now. Reading a lot about how A&R has evolved and having conversations with people in the industry, I think before or now it's evolved, right, to like data, leveraging data, right? And so many people talk about data. You can, of course, leverage this data to find these up and coming artists. But then once you do or decide that you want to invest in this artist and work with this artist, what do those conversations kind of look like early, to promote that strategy and kind of sometimes force the artist to go slow before they can go fast? I mean, we've all seen documentaries of artists from decades ago and kind of all the pre-work they did before even being pushed to being allowed to release a single or being allowed to perform a song. And that looks very different now. It almost seems like things are backwards, but not in a reverse engineer backwards. It's more just like this happened, and so now let's capitalize on that. And I think that we're kind of seeing some of the negative effects of premature success, if you will.
Yeah, for sure. I think that on a more recent level, I think about Olivia Rodrigo here in the US. Everyone saw how big Sour was, and they were like, oh, well, you could go tour arenas now. And it sounds like her and her team talked about it. They're like, no, we're going to stick to the halls that we have. And it looks like she's performing in venues that have, roughly several thousand, capacity. At least that's what I saw here when she came through in San Francisco. And I think she may have done like Radio City or some of the others. I would have to check. But I feel like that makes sense, just given that. But I think this dynamic is even more pronounced in Africa, which a lot of the artists which have recently become superstars there as well. And you talked a lot about that in the piece. And Burna Boy, who I think is a great case study on this.
Yeah. Yeah. I one, just love the music coming out of the continent. And two, I think it's really fascinating in the way artists have to position their careers to really succeed both in the continent and on a global scale. Part of it in a way probably comes from socioeconomic factors. And then as well as just having like really migrant diasporas. But because of that, artists are like really, I think, forced to prioritize performing in the beginning. And when you look at the audience, right, it is kind of those things that don't scale. It's the weddings, it's the really small club performances, it's the open mics, like things that used to be very common for artists everywhere, but seems like has kind of slowed down. And so as a result, I think like they even without having an A&R, they kind of do their own A&R, right? You've heard stories of artists who would come to a country once and like nobody came to see them, and then 3 years later, the show was sold out. And so artists are not only able to refine their performances, they get quick feedback loops, and they do it in a way that I think is authentic to them and their sound, and it forces them to win people over, right? If you're performing at a wedding, the percentage of people that might like you could be high, could be low, but ultimately you want to walk away with more fans, right? These people are giving you an opportunity to convert them, or at least to try. Whereas now I think there's unfortunately a little bit of entitlement that comes with some artists, right? It's just kind of, even from being upset when the audience doesn't react a certain way, and that's just like a humility that I think African artists have embraced in terms of converting the fan or converting the listener, and I think you see that even more when the artist really begins to take a global approach. Everybody from DeVito shouting out the power of New York, or why music from the continent has been able to get so big as of recently. And so I think that African artists are a great example in terms of looking to kind of do that slow climb and that slow work, to be able to get to the point where they can sell out arenas today.
Right. It's like the constraints that the industry has force them to do the
Yeah,
things that don't scale. And because they did
exactly.
that, that's how they're in the position they are today. And that's why Burna Boy's selling out Madison Square Garden, right?
Exactly, and it's a safe space, if you will, to get feedback. I think so often as an artist, you're of course refining who you are and creative direction and all of that, but there's just some things that come from experience with being a performer, and constantly just having those feedback loops to iterate on what songs work, what transitions work. When you see a Beyonce at Coachella, that's years and decades of being able to study crowd reaction, of how certain things flow, what works, what doesn't work to put on a show like that.
Yeah, the feedback loops piece is key too, because obviously that's going to be harder to get from a festival because you don't even know if half these people are just, burning time until the headliner comes. But you can actually see
Yeah.
what the folks you're trying to reach resonate with. And this is something that I always thought about. Tyler Perry, of course, this isn't music, but with his plays, he would always talk about this, how he would switch things up. He's going on this large tour across different parts of the country. He's going to use certain jokes or use certain lines that are going to work in the South, that aren't going to work in the Northeast, and aren't going to work on the West Coast, and things like that. And anyone that is performing that actually sees how the people that they are reaching interact with the stuff while they're doing it, it almost
Yeah.
always leads to a better product, so that when they are doing the movies or when they are doing the mass thing, they can hit the ground running.
Yeah, that's really true. And, as you're talking, it makes me think about like maybe there's even a certain archetype of artist and like one that doesn't like heavily involve performance. Like I think a lot about comedians and what a comedian looks like now. You have Instagram comedians or, TikTok comedy as it's referred to, but not many of them are thinking about going on tour or doing stand up. And so maybe in some ways, even all encompassing performer is different now.
Yeah, yeah. I do think that for the people that are doing things live, it is easier to see it. I think that honestly, for people that write or podcast, it can be tougher because
Yeah.
any type of feedback, there has to be at least some level of intent to let me reply to this email or let me follow up. I do think it's relatively easier for someone that has a newsletter to be able to do it relative to someone
Yeah.
that's just writing standalone on a website. But I do think that when podcasters have live events and that is attracting people in a certain area, like that's how they're able to get around this. But everyone, I think most creators, the more IRL things you have, whatever it is that you create, you're going to get more value out of that.
Yeah, I totally agree with you there.
Yeah. The person that I think actually kind of challenges this with some nuanced perspective is Cardi B, especially at the highest level, just considering that it's been 4 years since Invasion of Privacy. I think it's been 5 years since Bodak Yellow came out, which is wild to say, but we really I think there's a few things. One, she's yet to do a true formal tour, and she's been the first to say that with, hey, I'm getting 7-figure guarantees to go do stuff over in Europe, and sometimes I even get those checks here in the US to perform and headline festivals. Why would I go through all of the things that are involved with touring? And to be fair, there are some challenges that many artists have with touring, whether it's okay, making sure that the lighting and everything is set up right and the production looks great on that first event that you have, because if that doesn't hit right, then that's going to impact the sales for everything else. So even though we know that, yeah, that's part of doing things that don't scale, you have to do it, some artists are fearful of that. And I think sometimes she may, or at least she's alluded to her avoiding that, or even just the cost. Like she even talked herself about how the first time she did Coachella, it cost her more money
Yeah.
than she actually got from the events of doing it, just because of how much she spent on those things. And, she, at least from her perspective, sounds like she wants to be able to build up leverage, likely in order to command a, 40, 50 plus city arena tour that would likely match up with her star power. And
Yeah.
I feel like that's part of the thing, because I remember there was this debate going on where people were wondering, okay, if she does, like what she would do. And of course, all the Nicki Minaj haters would be like, oh, well, she's not doing a tour because she can't
Yeah.
sell out a tour. And it's like, okay, I don't think it's that, egregious. You all can, the barbs can relax a bit. But I do think that, part of what I think makes it kind of tough, especially from a social following perspective, which I know is something that we've talked about before, is that with certain artists, the reason that people follow you, you mentioned this earlier, isn't always because they're like vibing with your music. I mean,
Yeah.
Cardi B puts out a lot of, beauty shots to show off her
Yeah.
fashion, to show off her glamour. And some people may like that stuff and they may have not even listened to WAP or any of the,
Yeah.
bigger hits she has. So how do you quantify that? So I'm very interested to see, one, what this next album looks like and what her next live performance strategy looks like.
Yeah, if I was like thinking about what would be interesting for Cardi B, I think ultimately it'd be kind of a hybrid experience, right? Like, I think you nailed it on the head in the sense that Cardi is a lifestyle brand that has many different pillars that stand for many different things, and people really resonate with her. But for all types of things, and so you see more artists creating their own festivals, and I don't know if there's a potential to like pilot what that like hybrid concept could look like, maybe in the Bronx or somewhere unique to her. But I think that ultimately it will need to encompass everything that she represents. And so while the music will of course be one of those pillars, I feel like it could be or would be so much more. And given that she has so many brand deals and endorsements with companies that really appreciate her for the lifestyle brand that she is, I think it could be really, really unique. Even a partner with a festival promoter, Rolling Loud is working with Chris Brown, Lil Baby as they go on tour. Like even to have that partnership in a way that's really authentic and unique to her, I think is going to be fascinating. I feel like she's the artist that can kind of push the envelope in terms of experiencing her or artists in a way that we haven't necessarily thought of. So often I think about like the rise of nightclubs and like branded parties. And right now you kind of see like two things, right? There's like really popular nightclubs that will just exist by virtue of like being a marquee name, whether that's the Live and Live on a Sunday. But then you also have parties, right? And the parties exist without the venues. One I constantly think about is like Everyday People. And Everyday People is the party. It's not about where Everyday People is, more so where they're going. And so I think that's like a similar thing that Cardi brings, and the ability that she's so much of the brand that it's more so about what she wants to do and where she'll bring people to that medium, versus following the traditional way things have been done before.
Yeah, I think the branded piece, and especially being able to have some type of partner with the concert or with the
Yeah,
tour more broadly, would be big because I'm thinking about some of the recent ones we've seen, and even some of these are just slight nuances, like Kendrick Lamar partnered with Cash App for his
yeah,
Big Steppers tour he has coming up. I saw The Weeknd has one of these crypto companies. I think it's
yeah,
Binance. Yeah, Binance
yeah,
is doing his tour, and he's doing like a big stadium tour for this run that he has coming up. And I think that just opens it up to be like, yeah, you can have many other folks. It doesn't always necessarily have to be, Visa credit card holders to get the pre-check or whatever it is
yeah.
to get the early thing. You can actually have, other partners that are aligned with many of the brands and partnerships that Cardi has already had relationships with.
Yeah. And I really thought, the Kendrick and Cash App partnership was fascinating to me, because of, I feel like the message it sent, right? Like, to me, it almost said, like, let's make this tour accessible to all our fans, versus the barrier to entry. While it's nice to have an Amex Platinum, not everyone does. So like versus the barrier to entry, and I think that's another really important thing with touring, right? Like controlling the barriers to entry in which your fans get to see you. And so it just really symbolized to me that like in a way Kendrick like wants his biggest fans there, and he's going to remove the barriers to entry, to do so. So that was I really enjoyed seeing that partnership.
Yeah, that's a great point because I think one of the challenges that we've seen over the years with live shows and live entertainment pricing for events is artists that are trying to price things in a way to give fans a fair chance, but also understanding that the reseller market is going to, take it up to a crazy amount. And then you have artists buying back and then trying to sell it themselves as resellers. And I know it can just get so messy when you see that, but I think it's clearly done because they want to be able to make sure that the actual fans can do it. But yeah, if you're just giving it to like Amex Platinum and Black Card holders, then it isn't
Yeah,
going to work. Like we've all seen the
exactly.
dynamics of how Cash App grew. Cash App grew because of hip hop fans, because of
Yeah.
hip hop influencers pushing this. And then that's how they're able to grow in the South and grow in places that Venmo didn't grow. So have it all lined up if you're trying to reach those people.
Exactly, exactly. In the years to come, and especially with the rise of tech, and really, probably as a result of rising customer acquisition costs on Facebook ads and other platforms, partnering with tech companies is going to be a great source of revenue, and I think just authentic partnership for artists. And ultimately, it'll come down to their methodology behind choosing the right partners and what it says about how they value or how they desire to connect with their audiences. So I'm excited to see more partnerships, especially I guess not just in the fintech space, but consumer technology space overall. And I think we can tell, even just as regular fans, whether it's authentic or not. Cash App made so much sense. Everybody was like, of course. And I think the best part about it was people were like, oh, I have an account. Like I've already done X thing. And so this just naturally fits in with my lifestyle.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we'll see more of it. I hope we continue to. I know a lot of these companies have been US based, but I'm really excited to see what's going to be coming from Africa specifically because there's so much music activity. We already talked about the artists coming through and how the artists themselves in many ways will have better chops just because of the constraints that, are there that currently exist, which we talked about earlier. What are you seeing in the space? What excites you?
Yeah, I've been really excited about everything coming out of the continent, both from a music standpoint and venture standpoint. It's interesting because for a long time, telcos have been heavily involved in underwriting artist careers, right? So a lot of performances and even festivals are heavily sponsored by telcos on the continent, and so they've always had a role, and I think kind of understood the value in investing and partnering with artists early. I think what's evolving is the amount of money coming to the continent, especially as it relates to startups and funding tech companies. And so as a result, like they realize the value as well in investing in music. And you see a lot of those partnerships. I mean, Chipper Cash is partnered with Burna Boy, right? And so like looking at like one of the most valued fintech companies in Africa and one of the biggest artists in Africa, I think we're going to continue to see those relationships and those partnerships. I also think that it's going to evolve to, and a natural progression that we saw here is that artists want a bit more of the pie. And so while, speculating, I think a lot of these deals are, cash, maybe a small range of cash and a little bit of equity. I think we're going to see artists want to become a lot more hands-on, especially for projects that are commoditized. And in a lot of ways, remittances or some of these fintech products are really dependent on your ability to have a license. And so as artists maybe get to start to be able to navigate that landscape and bring together teams, I wouldn't be surprised to see them launch products of their own in similar spaces.
Yeah, it's exciting. I mean, there's so much. I also look at what's happening in music specifically. Of course, as we know, all the major record labels have presence, not just in the continent overall, but in the different areas. I mean, it's huge. You can't just have presence in South Africa and think you're going to cover everything happening sub-Sahara or
Yeah.
everywhere else. Like you need to be focused on what's happening in particular areas. And I think too, we saw earlier this year, Andreessen Horowitz had made its first investment in that mobile games company, Carry
Yeah.
First. I think we're going to see more and more of that. And I do think that we're going to see even more innovation happening in music. I know that all the streaming services have been trying to acquire more subscribers and more listeners in those places, but
Yeah.
the dominant listening in many ways is still downloads and the companies that have been able to focus on that. So there's so
Yeah.
many unique aspects that I'm excited to see play out.
Totally. Another, I guess, thing that's really interesting to me is the kind of the conversation lately as it relates to like what type of music has dominated. I've seen and talked to a lot of folks who kind of hypothesize that like the reason music coming out of the continent has grown so much is because it's very universal in a way where everybody can participate, like say on the dance floor, or just experiencing the music versus kind of some of the hip hop and rap music that has dominated. That's really driven by club culture and bottle popping culture, and VIP and sections and that whole thing. And so I find that dynamic fascinating as well, in the kind of the universal sense that it brings. And you see that on like TikTok, like how many like dances can you make to a song about like popping bottles versus just like a really great beat.
Right, right. Yeah. Do you feel like TikTok is having the same impact there on the continent that it is in the US? Or are you noticing anything that's unique or different?
I really think that music coming out of the continent in a lot of ways, it really does like describe like the tastemaker culture. As someone who's spent, time in Ghana as well as in the States, like I always hear the songs first in Ghana. I learned about Amapiano in Ghana, even Peru. I was in Ghana back in August, and that's when I first heard the song. Like I think because of the just diaspora nature, right? So people like myself or other second gen folks going home and saying like, oh wow, this is what's the next big thing out here, and kind of taking it back allows for that to happen. So in a lot of ways, I feel like I go or spend time on the continent to see what's new, and then TikTok is probably the biggest indicator of what's most likely to take off from there. But I would look at some of these cities, especially around nightlife, as more of the curators and the tastemakers, and TikTok just being a mirror of, in some ways, the work that's already been done.
Okay, so it's more so following the culture, not setting it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think to some extent I would say maybe it's a little different in the US because I do think that what we see on TikTok in some ways does set where people end up following, at least here,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because I think you just see so many trends originating from things people do. You're more likely to see clips from TikTok posted and shared on other platforms as opposed to what you may see vice versa. So
I
I feel
agree.
like, yeah.
I agree. I think it's definitely very different, and I think it's what makes being an artist a little tricky, because if you are an American artist, for example, and your song is becoming the biggest thing in Ghana, that probably has very different implications for how you navigate that, or how you think about career and how you think about strategy. And unfortunately, I guess if you're an artist maybe who has risen on TikTok primarily in the States, what does that mean when it comes time for touring or time to do a date? How is that attention converted? Because the fact of the matter is, American fans just have more opportunities to patronize their favorite artists. When you look at the amount of venues and just like analysis to ways you can interact with artists here, there's just so many options, and so that conversion rate is really high, or is harder.
Yeah. And that reminds me of something else I've heard artists say. This isn't anything new, but they've said that they always get more love when US artists specifically, they always get more love when they perform outside of the US because
Yeah.
the US artists, they see plenty of things there, or the US fans necessarily, they have more opportunities to see you. So they're not necessarily as like wowed, or they take the moment in as special as it is, as opposed to the artists that are going outside of the US
Yeah,
and
yeah.
performing.
I talked to folks around when J. Cole performed in Nigeria, and I think that was such a great example. Like he had just released the album that day and was shocked that people knew every word. And specifically, I think when artists come to the continent, it's always an occasion, right? People are really excited. Cardi B was a great example. People are just like really excited in some ways that they're like participating. Like we didn't go to you, you came to us. You value us enough to do that. And I think, regardless whether it's Africa or Japan or even Europe, like there's just a different level of appreciation, and people really hold on to it as an experience that will be with them. And unfortunately, unfortunately, because of some of these festivals, like you can casually see an artist that you don't even like that much multiple times. Like, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but let's say if you go to every Rolling Loud festival in New York just once a year, how many artists have overlapped, or how many artists have you seen multiple times just as a result of patronizing that one festival? And so as a result, the star power, the whole je ne sais quoi, kind of falls away. But I think you don't get that same type of, I guess, performance burnout or consumer burnout when you do headline your own tour, because it's something different every time. It's experiencing, Beyonce fans, I'm sure, will talk about this, but I think that's the beauty in what her Coachella performance was. Everyone knew the songs, right? We knew the music for the most part, but it was now just experiencing it in a different way, and in a way that she wanted us to experience it. And unfortunately, I don't think artists get to do that in the same way with festivals they're not headlining.
Yeah, the Rolling Loud example always makes me think of Future. I always say that he has low key residency at that. I actually went back and counted this. I forget how many Rolling Louds there have been, but at least 40% of them he has been a headliner.
Wow.
I mean, it's a high number. And to your point, I mean, I'm sure the paycheck's great. I'm not concerned about, Future from a money perspective. He
Yeah.
is prolific, and I mean, he had one of the best selling albums so far this year. But yeah, to your point, that is kind of, I think, Future's model that clicks with that as well. He's going to put out music early and often. He's going to perform, and he's always going to be there. And I think for him, it works, but it's just not going to be the same thing necessarily as a Beyonce record or something like that.
I'm curious, how do you think that impacts like an artist's elasticity? Like, of course, with more and more artists selling their catalogs, and navigating the world as an artist very differently. How do you think that does impact their just elasticity in the music game overall?
I think it's twofold, because I think that to one point, a lot of artists do feel like they have to keep the content machine turning. I
Yeah.
think that's the kind of lines up with Daniel Ek, Spotify CEO, and what he had said that was a polarizing statement at the time of you releasing music through every 3 years isn't going to be enough anymore. So I do think that someone like Future has leaned into that and say, okay, I have this base, and I know they're going to listen to everything that I put out whenever I do it. So let me maximize that. And I think for someone like Future, because as popular as he is with a particular demo, one, his mainstream popularity isn't quite where it was like when like DS2 came out in
Yeah.
2015. So he's definitely serving more of the large, but core fans. And I think just given some of the issues that people have about him, and of course we've all seen the memes about,
Yes.
problematic Future sending,
Yes.
the text to the ex or whatever it is, like, I don't think that he necessarily has the same marketability to, let's
Mhm.
say, go launch a, huge whatever it is, the same way that we've seen a Beyonce or
Yeah.
Rihanna do it. That doesn't mean he can't. Obviously, he sells the platform. So I do think for him, and even someone like an NBA YoungBoy who,
Yeah.
is even younger, them releasing music early and often kind of works for them, because they may not get, like the big deal from whatever company wanting to partner with them, but they can reach their fans directly. So they're going to maximize that. So I think it's a little different though, when you are a Beyonce or you are a Rihanna, where, there's so many other things you're doing. So when you release music, you do want it to hit, because you want it to have this halo effect over everything else that you're doing. There's
Yeah.
anomalies to this, of course. I mean, or not anomalies, but I think some folks do it differently. I mean, Drake is still going to give you a release every year, every other year. Kanye West has likely been doing the same, but I do think that that's still different than, how like Future's going about it.
Agreed. Agreed. I agree. I wonder 10 years from now or 15 years from now, if Future is still touring or even releasing music, what that relationship looks like, and even what a tour would look like given the brevity of music he's put out.
Yeah, to be honest, I think he likely will. It's just a matter of like, what does it look like, how big, and like, like the
Yeah.
dynamics there. I recently posed the question on Twitter, which artists do you expect to still be releasing music when they're 70 plus years old? I don't think many people mentioned him, but I would definitely put him in that category. I feel like not too far away from 40. I do think that, he loves this for better or worse. And
Yeah.
I feel like he'll likely continue.
Yeah, yeah, and I think in rap it's still so new, which is crazy. That we just haven't seen enough examples of that, and so these probably or artists like Future will be those examples for us to look back at.
Definitely. And I think so much of this, and with this whole conversation, we're talking about the relationship between fans and how fans really help you format what you're doing and how to really set the framework for your career. And this aligns with the work that you're doing now. You recently launched and announced the company you have with Stan that is helping artists have a more fan focused approach to their career. So, can you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, yeah. So I recently decided to go full time on a music tech startup called Stand, focused on audience engagement infrastructure. So really to help artists understand their audiences at a micro and macro level, with the goal of providing better fan experiences. I kind of think it's crazy in some ways that every industry that wants to encourage a repeatable customer behavior has a loyalty program. But unfortunately, artists have very fragmented loyalty programs. And of course, through the rise of NFTs and specific things as it relates to streaming platforms or even email lists, we've seen artists make great attempts, I think, at doing that and running really effective programs. But I really want to add more science to the arts to create, if you will, moments of magic on a greater scale so artists can better connect with their fan bases.
Nice. Where did the inspiration come from? I'm sure a lot of it is
Yeah.
things we talked about in this conversation,
Yeah.
but
So
what
much of
brought it to life?
it, interestingly enough, has come from writing. I've long admired, of course, Trapital and other platforms, and really just wanted to explore like the conversation of fan relationships. And I think fan relationships have evolved so much, but wanted to kind of like push the envelope in terms of what was being explored as it relates to the fan artist relationship, and also highlight how sophisticated fans are. Of course, with the rise of stands and how much they're covered. I think that people think of fans as just like, okay, like a casual listener, and then the overzealous fan. And I think there's such a gap, and fandoms operate in such a sophisticated way that we really needed to push the conversation on what that looked like. And as a result, the more I kept writing, the greater like the problem became to me, in the sense of I think there's a lot of really amazing platforms designed to be direct to fan and connect the artist to the fan. But for anybody that's in any type of relationship business, I think it feels a little used car salesman to like try and extract money like immediately, like, hey, I just met you, like give me this thing. And so I felt like there was an over focus on the monetization of fan bases before fan bases were frankly strong enough to survive that monetization. And so I kind of wanted to take it back a step to say, if you have a really strong relationships are everything, right? You'll be able to survive, and not even just survive, thrive, because you can withstand volatility and maybe even turmoil.
So, what does it look like from the artist perspective? Like, if I
Yeah.
wanted to get involved, like, what does that engagement look like?
Yeah. So we're currently in the experimentation phase, playing around with products and experiments that allow us to hit product market fit. The biggest, and we're gearing up for a beta. So I love to talk to any artists that think really intensely about connecting with their fans. But ideally, we love to work with artists that want to create like what I call moments of magic. And so like some great examples is J. Cole, right? Like not only the Dollar and Dream tour, but going to his fans' graduations. Or how do you actively and naturally involve yourself in your fans' life in a way that feels authentic and encourages a bidirectional relationship. So as a result, a lot of the work that we're doing is analyzing artists and their current data sets, as well as tapping into new data sets as a result of creating games, as well as just different forms for artists to connect with their fans. So any artist that one thinks deeply about this, that wants to understand their data better across multiple platforms, we'd love to talk to you, especially as we work with artists on an ad hoc basis to gear up for the launch of the platform.
Makes sense. I mean, as we both know, this type of need is more crucial than ever. And there's so much data that can be misleading or misunderstood, as we've talked about before. You can't just go on follower account. You can't
Yeah,
just go on Spotify listens.
yeah.
Some of these things correlate, but a lot of them don't.
Yeah, it's so true. I think Spotify Wrapped is always so interesting to me, in the sense that it's great, right? And what became even more interesting was when fans of course post, but then to see artists post, right, and kind of what that meant for them and the excitement. And so there were things that I felt like off the bat, like certain artists expected to get, right? You expected to have every country represented when it came to countries listened, or just certain things represented. But I thought a lot about it. And I was just like, that one snapshot into a portion of your fan base, like, what does that tell you from an actionable data perspective? I guess before we can even know how relevant or how much you can guide your actions around those results is how much of your fan base is on Spotify. Like you mentioned, in Africa, like a lot of music is listened through downloads or partnerships with telcos and other streaming platforms. People use AudioMac and Boomplay, and different streaming platforms. And so without like knowing in aggregate what your Spotify listeners even represent when it comes to your audience, it can also be a slippery slope to make directions based on the most advanced data sets if they're not really replicative of your whole audience.
One of the things that I often see with Spotify specifically is that people will, especially in the US, they'll use it as like a rule of thumb to say that, okay, you see the data that comes through from Spotify, either multiply it by 3 or 3.5 or 4, and maybe that gives you a rough idea of how big the overall streaming market is for a particular artist. But that works in the US. That doesn't work for artists elsewhere. So being able to see those distinctions, especially considering how global the music industry is, that's where people can actually make actionable insights.
Exactly, exactly. I think, artists really starting to approach their careers from a global standpoint will be really, really helpful moving forward, and as they consider the elasticity of their own careers, especially given that like smaller markets can be more forgiving, right? And so even if you don't want to maybe necessarily go through the 50 city, 500 person venue tour, what about going to just a smaller market globally, and getting that feedback, being able to perform, really connecting with your fans that way too. So I completely agree with you. I think that artists are just going to really have to be global from day one. And as a result, just because you're familiar with consuming music in a certain way isn't necessarily how your entire fan base is going to do it. And so becoming more sophisticated around what that looks like and how you can best work with those platforms will be really, really advantageous moving forward.
And you're in a great position to be able to do that. So I feel like the timing lines up well with this. So for you specifically, for the people that either are listening or whether they're artists or working with artists,
Yeah.
where can they follow up? Where can they go if they
Yeah,
want to learn
yeah.
more?
So you can find me on Denisha Kuhlor at Twitter. Love Twitter, so always on there. And then you can just shoot me an email at d@stand.fan as well.
Sounds good. Denisha, this was great. I feel like we covered a bunch of things that are happening right now in the industry, and yeah, very timely. So thanks again for coming on.
Of course. Thanks for having me.